Hello, Lisa Muggeridge again talking. I promised you before I start that playlist on Wednesday about what's maintaining political stability and looking at the political landscape that we emerge into post-Brexit, post-coronavirus, post-neoliberalism, that I would do one final video about the UK Labour Party and the kind of Twitter bubble that they've gone to die in. Now, the reason that this is necessary is not for any personal feelings about the Labour Party, but actually it's about the number of institutions that are left unable to function until they have played out this current crisis and either died away or adapted to the new environment they are in. And it's actually a substantial number of institutions. And it's understanding just how many institutions are not functioning because of them and the impact of that, which allows us to develop answers to why the UK has struggled so badly to adapt to the context changing around it and the new kind of changing world balance of power. Now, in order to understand this crisis, you have to understand the structure of the Labour Party. But if you actually logged onto Twitter on any given day, you'd find people discussing in a lot of detail Labour's institutional factional history. This faction arguing about this faction with this faction about things that happened a long time ago. But in actual fact, this history is not important to anybody apart from people within the Labour Party. The Labour Party legacy identity is one that came into being before democracy itself came into being in the UK. It was instrumental to democracy emerging. But this legacy identity, while it might fuel a lot of self-righteousness on Twitter, it's not really relevant to anybody else. And the current Labour Party and Labour movement is the remnants of what's left after the Blair government and the Brown government finished in 2010. We're now in 2021. Now, I've put underneath an article that I wrote in 2011 for Labour Uncut, which explained that the political map was being redrawn and that they were sleepwalking into irrelevance. And what I've also put underneath is a documentary which shows the last time that this crisis emerged, this civil war that Labour are always in, emerged as part of our national political story. Now, this happened at the birth of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the political and economic settlement that's defined the world since then and which is now over. And this is like an economic settlement which involves an economics which is actually blind to the rule of law, blind to the systems that developed in the last quarter of the 20th century necessarily, and relied on a media landscape that was broadcast only. So you could broadcast things that were not true and then people couldn't challenge it. Now, the problem is, in 2010, Labour kind of fully embraced this Twitter environment where there was a social dimension to political communication. And they did not consider the extra dimensions to their environment, that they would be mixing with people. They didn't consider their institutional dysfunction, the fact that quite a lot of people in this culture are really not very nice. And also the difficulty in selling media narratives that are not true in an environment where you're mixing with people would require abuse and intimidation. And the problem is that what's become apparent is rather than considering their new dimensions to their environment, they just assumed that abuse and intimidation could substitute for what they used to have. And they're locked in these narcissistic circles, but this is causing problems everywhere else. Now, the core structure of the Labour Party is really important. Now, we're all familiar with the Labour Party as a political party. They send MPs to Westminster. They are elected. They're part of a binary, left and right, Tories, Labour, that we're all familiar with. But it's actually this binary that's the problem. Their current strategy is just subordinating any conversation that they have into this left-right binary, even though when you're discussing policies like benefits, social care, marginalisation, there is no difference. You know, these are things that are subject to consensus. So these techniques no longer work. Now, as well as the parliamentary party, you also have local democracy. So this is local councillors, mayors, people operating in most towns in the country. And they also have representatives at the House of Lords, both hereditary and life peers. But this is not the entirety of the Labour Party culture, because a considerable amount of their political power comes from trade unions. Now, trade unionism kind of underwent a massive transformation in the 20th century. In the early 20th century, trade unionism was about heavy industry, manufacturing. But in actual fact, the economy changed quite significantly. We went from, by the time the 20th century closed, trade unionism in this country was centered into public sector institutions, civil service institutions, and institutions concerned with things like care, with the rule of law, and crucially, this added another dimension to the responsibilities of unions, which was the vulnerable service users that these institutions represented. So Unison, who see themselves as a labour tool, were actually representing local authorities, the most vulnerable people in the country, looked after children, social care users, the bottom line of political responsibility. So as well as representing very low paid workers with very serious responsibilities, they were also representing these people. So subordinating but instead of actually knowing that this is what they represent, they've chosen instead to subordinate these people so it can be used as a labour tool. PCS is the trade union who represent HMRC and benefit workers and then directly represent benefit claimants as a result. But in actual fact, the PCS have been occupied for quite some time by an organisation who were previously known as militant, who are always ready for this civil war within the Labour Party. So in the period where welfare policy and local authority policy came up with a death toll of possibly near 100,000 people, both PCS and Unison were subordinating those people and actively denying them political representation so that they could facilitate a takeover of the Labour Party through Jeremy Corbyn, although I think Unison are a bit more Blairite. But it doesn't matter because they're supposed to represent local authority workers. The final union that are really important are Unite. Now, Unite are an amalgamation of lots of trade unions. And all these it's not just public sector, but private sector trade unions, lots of different unions joined together in a super union with Len McCloskey at the head. But Len McCloskey sees himself as a kingmaker in the Labour Party, and so this leaves lots and lots of sectors without representation, while a little political culture, the one that you can see in that documentary I put underneath, has fossilised to prevent trade unions functioning to represent these people. Now, without trade unions functioning, government has no way to know about changes in these institutions, about problems, about political instability that's coming, about, the real life. This is trade unionism and representation is direct political representation of people. This is a really important function that is disabled because these people are focused on the labour identity and constant civil war. And the final piece of the puzzle with the labour structure is their belief in their right to dominate social movements. Now, because labour came into being before democracy came into being, direct democracy has been a key part of what the labour movement should be. Now, we all have the right to participate in democracy, and in democracy we have a responsibility to participate in democracy when we think things are wrong. And it's actually this that has caused the major problems, because it works in symbiosis with the other aspects of the Labour culture. And it results in Labour media cultures and Labour Party cultures seeking out social movements where there may be dissent, to actually subordinate it. With the Iraq War, this resulted in, it was a war where 2 million people marched to oppose it, where 1 million people died, but where all the opposition was channeled into this obsolete elite left-wing culture and the Stop the War movement at the top. So we ended up with the likes of George Galloway, and with austerity it resulted in the likes of Owen Jones and the Navarra brats placing themselves in competition with vulnerable people from backgrounds including Oxford University and these trade unions, using trade union power paid for by vulnerable people to subordinate those people, to actively prevent them accessing democracy, and then using the power they gained to try and take over the Labour Party. With trans rights activism, we saw that The Guardian and The New Statesman commissioned abusive male activists to be the face of trans rights, because it would be the new face of feminism and it would hide their position on austerity and its impact on women. This resulted in women being unsafe to speak. It's resulted in trans rights being threatened full stop. And it resulted in real threats to safeguarding and attempts to undermine safeguarding for children and real women being raped and harmed. in the movement that was a reaction against this activism, the same women, Ruth Sawatka, the Helen Lewises, they immediately thought that that movement was a place to exercise authority, to subordinate that discussion to the Labour identity that they shared. And we saw how that generated the threat of the far right. And the far right have been able to use the movement against trans rights activism to again threaten the same rules. And what was interesting about that is that even occurred in a movement specifically about safeguarding, specifically about equality legislation, that was part of the correction of recognising those systems. But because they did it by reflex, immediately that movement became unsafe and a place that was about the Labour identity. Now, the problem is it's not just limited to these institutions, it's also the policy-making and advisory institutions behind it, think tanks like the IPPR, major economic institutions like the London School of Economics, which I attended. The difference between economic and maths is the context changes around economics, but the LSE have missed it because they're still preserving the Fabian identity of bettering the poor at the core of their functioning. This means that the UK doesn't have an economics institution that has adapted to the economics in the 20th century being over. This is actually a major problem. Now, these institutions for the last kind of 10 years have been kind of focused on the Labour identity, while the context has changed massively. Austerity has generated crises which have forced recognition of systems around social care, around abuse, around violence. Coronavirus has forced recognition of these systems. Trans rights activism has generated recognition of the toxicity of this narcissistic mode of media-focused activism and jeopardise not only women's rights and safeguarding system, but trans rights as well. And Labour have backed themselves into a cul-de-sac. But the problem is that when they reach an election, because these are people who genuinely do not understand that they can be over, they don't understand that in democracy, voters have sovereignty. They rolled out a media strategy where they decided to flood chat rooms all over the country, Facebook chat rooms, buy, sell, swap groups, you know, abusing and intimidating people and sharing anti-Semitic propaganda. You know, this is the first political party to turn on Jewish people and to have its supporter base turn on Jewish people since Oswald Mosley in the 30s in Cable Street. And all of a sudden, normal people up and down the country were faced with anti-Semitic propaganda and no understanding how this could have occurred because they hadn't seen how Labour had stagnated on Twitter in the last 10 years. But even with all this dysfunction, even though Labour are currently disabled in terms of their own functioning, they have dysfunction within Westminster, within the House of Lords, think tanks, academic institutions, trade unions, and all these institutions are not functioning. We are a healthy, stable, functioning democracy, and democracy has taken care of them. But it means that they're unelectable ever again. And the problem is that now we will see crisis so that each of these separate institutions and separate components will come into relief through crisis. And we have to, as a country, withstand a period where some of these institutions will fail completely. If it's institutions like the LSE, and I very, very much doubt it, you know, this is a major loss for the country at a period in time where we need to be adjusting to the world outside and not focused on a Labour civil war. Now, one of the benefits of the Labour culture on Twitter is they give a very clear view, especially the media culture and the Navarro Brats and Owen Jones. They've given a very clear demonstration of the dysfunction that exists within Westminster and its associated media cultures. But this is actually dysfunction that's also reflected in the Conservative Party. This is a dysfunction that's shared, which is why the tribalism that drives them can exist. That kind of tribalism requires a substantial amount of homogeneity. And underneath it is the problem that this is a class identity. This is a very privileged class of people who have never mixed with the outside world, who have been demonstrating on Twitter for 10 years that they have no ability to function in the outside world. And now they don't understand why they're not electable. But luckily, we are a modern, pragmatic and stable country, and there are a myriad of ways to actually access democracy outside. Now, what I'm going to discuss we have this situation where our mediating class have kind of gone to die in this digital bubble, but we also have a new political landscape that we're entering into, and we are a stable country. So when I come back on Wednesday, what I'm going to start to discuss is what it is that's currently keeping the UK stable within within the domestic political scene. And then I'm going to move on to look at kind of where we fit in the kind of new world order, if that's, I'm not even sure that's the best phrase to use to describe it. So I will be back on Wednesday to discuss that. In the meantime, I'm still crowdfunding £350 for materials, research materials, books and equipment to kind of improve the quality of these videos. I'll put my Patreon and PayPal underneath. And I will be back. I'll be posting Wednesday and Sunday on the dot every week from now on. Thank you very much for listening.